November 16th, 1982. An abandoned SUV is found in the middle of a desolate Wyoming prairie, and numerous possessions are scattered all over the highway. The vehicle belongs to a former New York ad executive named Don Kemp, who has vanished without a trace. 4 years later, Don's skeletal remains are discovered in the same area, and it's ruled that he likely died of exposure after walking away from his SUV. However, 5 months after Don's disappearance, one of his friends allegedly receives a series of bizarre phone calls from him, causing his family to suspect foul play. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 9 of The Trail Went Cold. I am your host, Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a case which was featured on this podcast's all-time favorite TV show, Unsolved Mysteries. In fact, it's a piece of television history, as this was the very first case ever featured on the very first episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I've actually had numerous requests to cover this story from the folks on the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, so your wish is my command. Even though this is the one that got Unsolved Mysteries started, I didn't actually see this particular segment until decades after it aired. I came across it on YouTube a while back, back in the good old days when Unsolved Mystery segments were actually allowed to be posted on YouTube. And instead of hearing the iconic voice of Robert Stack, I was quite surprised to see Raymond Burr hosting and narrating the segment. Well, that's because Unsolved Mysteries did not actually start off as a full-time television series. It originally started out as a one-time only special which aired on NBC on January 20th, 1987, and Raymond Burr, he initially got the hosting gig. Over the course of the next year and a half, 6 more of these Unsolved Mysteries specials aired on NBC. Carl Malden actually got hosting duties on specials 2 and 3 before the reins were permanently turned over to the one and only Robert Stack. In October 1988, Unsolved Mysteries was finally picked up and turned into a full-time TV series, and it kept producing new episodes for the next 14 years. Anyway, the Don Kemp case is a prime example of a mystery which seems to have a simple logical explanation on the surface, but then there's that one major clue which just throws everything out of whack. I have previously featured this case in an article I published this past April at listverse.com titled 10 Creepy Mysteries Involving Abandoned Vehicles. There's not a lot of info out there about this story other than the Unsolved Mysteries segment and a couple of old articles I managed to dig up in the Google News archives, but I'm going to analyze it to the best of my ability. But before we get started, I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, and of course the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. I'm very happy to accommodate your requests for cases to cover whenever possible, but I should mention that I currently have a huge backlog of requests right now, so don't feel bad if it takes me a long time to get to the request you made. The Trail Went Cold runs on a bi-weekly schedule, and a new episode is posted every other Wednesday. We've got our own Facebook and Twitter pages, and another big thank you to all my followers there. We're also available on several new platforms. I've previously mentioned that we're on iTunes and Stitcher, but we can also now add Google Music to the mix. We can now be found there, so our podcast reach is continuing to grow. If you give us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Music, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure on these platforms and garner us some potential new listeners. I need to provide the obligatory shout out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is my fellow co-owner of The Back Row, the pop culture website which hosts this podcast. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. So let's flash back to 30 years ago and get the ball rolling on the very first Unsolved Mysteries case. Our story begins in 1982 and involves a 35-year-old New York City man named Don Kemp. A few years earlier, Don had himself a promising career as an advertising executive on Madison Avenue when he was involved in a serious traffic accident which had a profound effect on his life. And this would be the first of many examples from Unsolved Mysteries where I wanted to yell, "More details!" at the screen. Unfortunately, the segment doesn't provide any specific details about this accident, except that it left Don seriously disabled and that it took him 3 years to recover. And according to everyone who knew him, the accident caused a serious change in his personality and gave him a new outlook on life. Don apparently became disillusioned with materialism and wanted to start living a simpler life. So he gave up his career in advertising, sold nearly everything he owned, and decided he was going to leave New York and move to a scenic mountain retreat in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He was a huge Abraham Lincoln fanatic, and he wanted to write a new book about his assassination. So in September of that year, Don purchased a new Chevy Blazer, loaded up all his remaining possessions, and embarked on his journey. Presumably as research for his book, Don would spend the next 2 months traveling the Lincoln Heritage Trail, which is basically a series of highways that links together a bunch of historical locations which are connected to Abraham Lincoln. Before Don decided to settle into his retreat at Jackson Hole, he made a stop in Wyoming's capital city, Cheyenne, on November 15th. He visited a museum, wandered around for about 2 hours, and ended up leaving his attaché case behind, which contained some important possessions, including some of his diaries, traveler's checks, and a pair of glasses which Don usually required for driving. Shortly thereafter, he called the museum to inquire about his attaché case, and he said he would return to pick it up. But unfortunately, he never did, and this would be the last time Don Kemp was confirmed to be alive. The following morning, a pair of highway patrolmen came across Don's abandoned Chevy Blazer at an off-ramp on Interstate 80. This particular location was surrounded by nothing but a vast Wyoming prairie and was at least 40 miles from the nearest town. The SUV's engine was still running, the doors were left open, and a bunch of clothing was scattered all over the highway. In fact, the vehicle was so packed with the possessions that there was no room at all for anyone in there except the driver. But Don himself, he was nowhere to be found. However, there was a set of footprints in a patch of snow leading from the roadside onto the prairie, so apparently, for reasons unknown, Don had just walked away. A search effort was undertaken by the police to find him. And like I said earlier, this particular prairie was miles of open terrain, a vast expanse of nothingness. So if Don did walk away, you'd assume it wouldn't be too difficult to find him. Yet they never did. One of the sheriff's deputies even flew over the entire area in a plane, but he saw no trace of Don. However, the searchers did find footprints and a few items scattered about to indicate Don had traveled through there. About a mile away from the road, they found a duffel bag containing several items which belonged to Don, including some clothing, some laundry soap, and a teapot. The searchers later followed a set of tracks to a barn which was located 6 miles away from the highway. Inside they found 3 of Don's socks and a pile of sticks which had been arranged to start a fire. And while there were tracks leading inside the barn, there were no tracks leading away from it, which seemed to indicate that whoever went in there had gone back over their own footsteps when they left the scene. So it seemed like Don was making a concerted effort not to be found. The searchers continued to look for him for 3 days, but then a massive blizzard hit the area, and that was pretty much that. The police figured that if Don was still out there on the prairie, then there's no way he could have possibly survived the blizzard, so they gave up all hope of finding him alive. And sure enough, 4 years after Dawn's disappearance, some hunters found a set of skeletal remains about 3 miles from where Dawn's Chevy Blazer had been abandoned. And these remains were eventually identified as Dawn Kemp. The authorities found no signs of any foul play with the remains, so they concluded that Dawn likely got trapped in the blizzard and froze to death on the prairie 3 days after he disappeared. And that does sound like a pretty logical explanation. While I don't know the exact specifics of Dawn's mental health, he clearly had not been himself for quite some time, so it seemed likely that he had some sort of breakdown, abandoned his SUV, wandered out onto the prairie, and died of exposure. Case closed, right? Well, here's the thing. If that's all there was to this story, it never would have been the first case selected to be on Unsolved Mysteries. Dawn's mother, Mary Kemp, she appeared on the show, and she was adamant that her son had been murdered. She believed that Dawn was killed elsewhere, and that someone brought his remains back to the prairie to be discovered there 4 years later. Now, on the surface, that theory sounds pretty absurd. But this case does contain one very strange clue which causes you to look at things from an entirely different angle. 5 months after Dawn's disappearance, a friend and former co-worker of his named Judy Aiello returned to her apartment in New York City after an extended vacation. She checked her answering machine and found a total of 5 messages from someone who sounded just like Dawn. The caller seemed to be speaking in an urgent tone of voice, and in his last message he said, "I'd like to speak to you again, call me," before leaving a phone number. So Aiello called this number, and a man answered. When she asked if she could speak with Dawn, the man initially said yes, but then he abruptly changed his mind and said no. Aiello then asked him to give Dawn a message that she was returning his call, and the man said yeah, before he hung up. But she never did hear back from Dawn or get the opportunity to speak to him. When Aiello learned that Dawn was missing, the authorities got involved and her phone records were checked. And here's the weird part. The first 2 answering machine messages were left on February 27, 1983. The next 2 took place on April 5th, and the last one on April 10th. So if Dawn really did make those calls, then he couldn't have frozen to death on the Wyoming prairie the previous November. Anyway, the calls were traced to a trailer in Casper, Wyoming, which was over 150 miles away from where Dawn disappeared. And indeed, it was the same phone number which Judy Aiello had dialed when the mysterious caller left it on her machine. At the time, the trailer was being rented by a man named Mark Dennis, who was questioned by the Natrona County Sheriff's Department. Dennis denied making any of the phone calls to Judy Aiello and claimed to know nothing about Dawn Kemp or his disappearance. Dennis didn't really have any explanation for the calls, but he seemed to imply that someone else could have gone into his trailer and used his phone without his knowledge, or that the phone company simply made a mistake. Now, I've heard differing viewpoints on how Dennis handled his questioning by the police. In a Google News article I found from April 1984, the Natrona County Sheriff's Captain says that Dennis was cooperative at first and had initially agreed to take a polygraph, but then he soon hired an attorney and stopped talking to the police. However, during the Unsolved Mysteries segment, which was aired 3 years later, this same captain says that Dennis was nothing but cooperative, and he seemed fairly certain that Dennis had nothing to do with Dawn's death. But of course, at the time that article was written, Dawn was still a missing person. When Dawn's remains were found on the prairie years later, the police pretty much closed the case, and by that point they had no reason to suspect Mark Dennis. And I hate to say this, but by the time the Unsolved Mysteries segment was produced, I have a feeling that the police didn't think too highly of Dawn's mother, Mary Kemp. You see, Mary refused to accept the ruling that Dawn's death was an accident, and she launched her own investigation. And there were times when she almost seemed to be taking the law into her own hands. When Mark Dennis entered the picture, she seemed to think that the police weren't pressing him hard enough, so she traveled to Casper and tried questioning him herself. She spoke to Dennis on the phone, and she wanted to know why he never found it suspicious that these unexplained calls to New York were showing up on his phone bill all of a sudden. Dennis claimed that he paid the bill without even looking at it, but Mary responded by flat out calling him a liar. When Mary started accusing him of being involved in her son's disappearance, Dennis just hung up on her. And then, when Mary caught a glimpse of Dennis's phone bill and noticed that he had a habit of calling sex hotlines, she became horrified by the idea of this potential pervert possibly holding her son captive in his trailer. So she actually took it upon herself to visit Dennis's trailer and wait outside for him in an attempt to confront him, but I think he managed to avoid her. And then Dennis, he actually ended up moving out of the trailer, and he left town just 3 weeks after he was first questioned by the police. Now, I would definitely say that Mary Kemp was probably overstepping her boundaries here, and under the circumstances, I can't really blame Dennis for hiring an attorney and not talking to the police. But the phone calls aren't the only evidence that Don could have survived his trek onto the prairie. Months after Don disappeared, there were 2 unconfirmed sightings of him. One of the sightings was from a bartender who served him at a tavern, and the other one took place at a traveling exhibit of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia, which, as you know, was Don's favorite subject. And where did both these sightings take place? Casper. And they also occurred around the exact same time period as the phone calls. When this case aired on Unsolved Mysteries in 1987, Mary was hoping that the show would hopefully generate some tips from viewers who might be able to provide some concrete answers about what really happened to Don. But unfortunately, the trail went cold. As far as I know, there have not been any significant developments in this case during the past 30 years. So, what are we to make of this whole case? Well, like I implied earlier, if it wasn't for those bizarre phone calls from Casper, I don't think there would be much of a mystery here. In the Unsolved Mysteries segment, the patrolman who found Don's SUV makes an interesting comment, where he expresses his belief that Don didn't know what he was doing when he walked away, either because he was on medication, or he had actually run out of medication. While I don't have any specific details about the traffic accident Don was involved in years earlier, it seems very likely that the whole thing had a serious effect on his mental health. I have no idea if Don was actually on any medication at the time he disappeared, but if he was, I can't help but wonder if his meds might have been inside that attaché case that he left behind at the museum in Cheyenne. Before he had a chance to retrieve the case, Don could have had some sort of mental breakdown which prompted him to abandon his SUV in the middle of nowhere and wander out onto an open prairie. But there are numerous possibilities here. I've always found it strange that Don left behind his driving glasses at the museum. If the glasses were required for driving, you'd think that Don would notice they were missing before he, drove somewhere. So maybe his mental breakdown occurred long before he even made it to the prairie. In fact, while he was driving, I wonder if something caused Don to have a traumatic flashback to the accident which altered his life, and if it triggered him to abandon his vehicle and wander away. I have little doubt that Don left on his own accord, but the big question is, did he manage to make it off that prairie alive? Well, if it wasn't for those phone calls, my answer would probably be no, and I wouldn't have any reason to disbelieve the police's theory that Don froze to death during the blizzard. You might be wondering why the search party never found him, but when you trace Don's steps, it's apparent that he was taking great pains to avoid being found. Now, Don's mother has always believed that he was abducted from the same location his SUV was found. She thinks all those personal items of Don's which were found on the prairie and inside the barn, she believes they were planted there by someone to throw off the authorities, but I find that very unlikely. You might also wonder why it took 4 years to find Don's remains in that same area, but this type of thing happens all the time. I can cite numerous cases from Unsolved Mysteries where a person vanished in a remote wilderness area and the search party found no trace of them, yet years later, the victims' remains were discovered in the same area because they were missed the first time around. When you're dealing with nature and the elements, it's very easy for even the most skilled searchers to miss finding a human body or skeletal remains. When you consider that the prairie was hit by a blizzard 3 days after Don's disappearance, I have no problem believing his remains could be undiscovered for years. And let's also not forget that this was 40 miles away from the nearest town, so the only way Don could have survived is if he had managed to hitch a ride with someone. Now, we do have those eyewitness sightings of Don and Casper, but once again, I can cite numerous Unsolved Mysteries cases where an eyewitness was 100% sure that they'd seen a missing person, but it turned out that person was dead the whole time, and the witness was just mistaken. Of course, since the alleged eyewitness sightings of Don involved a connection to Abraham Lincoln, and they took place in the same town as those mysterious phone calls, I can't completely discount them. But if we're going to get to the bottom of this case, we have to look at it from one particular angle. If Don actually died on the prairie, how do we logically explain the phone calls? Well, one thing I'd really like to know is the exact content of those 5 answering machine messages that Judy Aiello received. All we know is that the caller ended his last message by saying, "I'd like to speak to you again, call me." But I must say, the Google News article I uncovered did manage to answer a key question which was not addressed during the Unsolved Mysteries segment. In the article, Aiello clarifies that at no point during any of these messages did the caller flat out say, "This is Don." She only came to the conclusion that it was Don because she thought she recognized his voice. I'm not entirely sure if the caller ever revealed any specific information to suggest it was Don, but if not, then that makes it a whole lot easier to believe that all these phone calls might have been nothing more than a prank orchestrated by Mark Dennis. But I've always had 2 major problems with the prank theory. Number 1, Judy Aiello had an unlisted number. Here's a little perspective. After Don's disappearance, his mother distributed posters throughout Wyoming which offered a reward and featured a phone number people could call if they had any information. If someone had called this particular number claiming to be Don, then yes, that sounds like an obvious prank. But why would a prankster call Judy Aiello? How would he even obtain her unlisted number? How would Mark Dennis or anyone else in Casper know this woman was friends with Don Kemp? And here's my second problem with the prank theory. The caller actually left their number and asked Aiello to phone him back. What kind of a prank caller leaves their home number on the victim's answering machine? If Dennis orchestrated this whole thing, then he certainly made it very easy on himself to get caught. Now, I'm sure it probably looks suspicious that Dennis moved out of the trailer and left Casper only 3 weeks after he was questioned by the police, but was this because he had something to hide? Or was it because Mary Kemp was practically stalking him by this point and camping outside his trailer? But yeah, even if Dennis was completely innocent, I can still see his logic for wanting to get the hell out of there. I'm now going to take this story in a slightly different direction. One thing I should clarify is that when I prepare these podcasts, I'm usually reluctant to discuss information I've seen from anonymous commenters or posters on message boards who claim they have first-hand knowledge of these cases. I mean, this is the internet, so people can write whatever they want. So unless these anonymous posters provide reason for me to believe that their information is credible, or the information they provide is verified by another valid sort, I'm very cautious about sharing this info on my podcast. But in this particular case, I am willing to make an exception. In the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries forum at the Sitcoms online message board, there is a lengthy thread about the Don Kemp case, and it contains 5 posts from someone using the handle JG Piper. And she claims that she's Don's sister. Now, I know that the real name of Dawn's sister is Kathy Dobe because she is interviewed during the Unsolved Mysteries segment. Of course, I can't be 100% certain that Kathy Dobe is J.G. Piper, but I have no real reason to disbelieve her, and either way, I still want to discuss some of the information she shared in her posts. I'll just say that the posts are an enigma, to say the least. Some of the info she provides manages to shed some light on the stranger aspects of this case, but some of the other info is way out there. So let's start with the way out there stuff. Okay, so according to Dawn's sister, the family sent his skeletal remains to a Dr. Angel at the Smithsonian Institute so he could determine a proper cause of death. I did a little searching, and there is an anthropologist named John Lawrence Angel who worked at the Smithsonian Institute during this time period. The guy has since passed away, but he's notable enough to have his own Wikipedia page. Anyway, Dr. Angel was apparently quite baffled by Dawn's remains because they appeared to be in perfect condition, and he found it very unlikely that they'd be in this condition if they had been out on a Wyoming prairie for 4 years. He seemed to think that Dawn had been dead for maybe about 1 year, 2 years tops. Dr. Angel also allegedly found a small hole drilled into the side of Dawn's skull, but he had no idea where it came from or what kind of tool could have made that hole. This is all pretty interesting stuff, but then the posts from J.G. Piper go into UFO territory. According to her, at the time Dawn disappeared, there was a team of UFO researchers in that same area who were investigating unexplained cattle mutilations. So the implication seems to be that the reason Dawn's remains just reappeared on the prairie after all those years in perfect condition was because he had been abducted by a UFO, I guess. But that's not all. J.G. Piper also shared a story about her and Dawn taking a trip to the infamous Mary Surratt boarding house, where the conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln was originally plotted. Apparently, Dawn had arranged for a psychic to hold a seance there, and a bunch of weird paranormal stuff happened. J.G. Piper speculates that Dawn had uncovered incriminating information during his research on the Lincoln assassination, which could have endangered his life. Yeah. Like I said, some of this stuff is way out there, and you just need to take all this information with a grain of salt. But there's one major reason I felt the need to mention all these posts. In spite of all her crazy stories about UFOs and seances and Lincoln assassination cover-ups, J.G. Piper actually provides a pretty logical explanation for the mysterious phone calls. She does not actually agree with her mother's theory that Mark Dennis kidnapped Dawn from the prairie and held him captive inside his trailer. Instead, she mentions an address book Dawn had, which was never recovered, and not among the possessions which were left behind in Dawn's SUV. And Dawn's sister believes that Mark Dennis somehow got a hold of this address book, which actually makes quite a bit of sense. She also mentions that Judy Aiello was a fairly famous, well-known artist in New York. Judy actually kept her identity a secret when she was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, but her name is mentioned in the Google News articles I found, so that's how I know her name. I did a Google search on Judy Aiello, and she is a fairly prominent figure in the New York art world, though it looks like her success came years after Dawn's disappearance. But even though her phone number was unlisted, Dawn had apparently written it down in his address book, so if Mark Dennis somehow managed to obtain it, that would explain how he was able to call her. I have no idea why Dennis would choose to phone her of all people, but if Dawn kept the names in his address book organized alphabetically, maybe Judy Aiello just happened to be the first name he saw. J.G. Piper theorizes that Dennis could have stumbled upon Dawn's abandoned SUV before the police arrived, found the address book, and took it with him. But I'm not so sure, because, like I said, this was out in the middle of nowhere, over 150 miles away from Casper, so what are the odds that Dennis would have been at this particular location? I'm actually more inclined to believe that Don could have lost his address book somewhere else. Remember, he did leave his attaché case behind at that museum in Cheyenne. So I've developed a theory about these alleged sightings of Don in Casper 5 months after he disappeared. What if these sightings are legitimate, but the witnesses got the timeline wrong? What if Don really did visit Casper, but this happened before he disappeared on the prairie? Remember, he was seen at a traveling exhibit of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia, which is the exact type of place Don would visit on his journey. If Don frequented Casper before he went missing, it's possible he could have lost his address book there, and Mark Dennis could have found it. And then, for whatever reason, Dennis decided to have a little fun by prank calling one of the numbers in the address book. Now, I can't imagine what Dennis's motive would have been to do something like that, or why he would have left his home number on Judy Aiello's answering machine. But remember, he never actually said he was Don Kemp in any of the messages, and Aiello only assumed he was Don because she thought their voices sounded similar. I think Dennis realized that his stupid prank had spiraled out of control when he discovered that he'd been tied to a missing persons case, and that's why he never admitted to making those calls. When Mary Kemp started hounding him and flat out accused him of kidnapping and murder, I think Dennis got scared, hired an attorney, stopped talking to the police, and just hightailed it out of Casper. If Don was still missing today, I'd be more inclined to think that Dennis was involved, but since Don's remains were discovered in the same area he disappeared, I believe Dennis's biggest crime was being an immature prank caller. While the theory about Dennis finding the address book isn't perfect, I do think that's the most logical explanation for the phone calls. And when you eliminate those calls, that really takes most of the mystery out of this story. And as much as I'd love to delve into J.G. Piper's theories about UFO abduction and Lincoln assassination conspiracies, there is no verifiable information out there to support any of that stuff. So I'm going to have to go with Occam's razor here. In the end, I think the police's theory about what happened is the correct one. I think that Don Kemp had some sort of mental breakdown, abandoned his vehicle, wandered out onto the prairie, and died of exposure when the blizzard hit 3 days later. Which would mean this mystery was technically already solved by the time Unsolved Mysteries profiled it. But don't get me wrong, this was a very good story for Unsolved Mysteries to choose for their first segment ever. The segment itself is very well done, and does a great job at establishing the tone of the show. But when you break everything down, the case is a lot less mysterious than many of the stories they would end up featuring on the show in the future. Whatever the real truth, I think we can all agree that whatever happened to Don Kemp was a terrible tragedy, and I can only hope that his family has found peace, or will at least find peace, someday. So, that's about it for this episode. But if you think my theory is wrong and have some hard information to suggest there was foul play involved in Don Kemp's death, please do contact the proper authorities. But if you have your own theory about what happened, I'd love to hear from you. Hell, if you have some more information about this case which wasn't covered here on this episode, such as more evidence to suggest that Don was a victim of UFO abduction, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email. I can be reached at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's ROBIN.WARDER@ICLOUD.com. robin.warder@icloud.com. Also, be sure to check out the Trail Went Cold on Facebook and Twitter. And like I mentioned at the start of this podcast, we're now available on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Music. So be sure to leave us a rating or a review at one of these places, because that will help garner us more exposure. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at the Back Row. So have yourself a good 2 weeks, and join me next time for another edition of The Trail Went Cold.
The Trail Went Cold is part of the Back Row Podcast Network. Visit the-back-row.com for more. The theme song was composed by Vince Nitro.